The May 2015 coup attempt against President Nkurunziza of Burundi failed. And since then, his president has managed to gradually reassert his power and reassert control over the country. He followed up on the coup attempt with a series of purges within the security services, within the military and the intelligence agency that were designed to remove officers who he suspected of being disloyal to him and of supporting the coup. What this has meant is that he's been able to reestablish his control, particularly over the capital in Bujumbura. There was a time when gun and grenade attacks were occurring regularly within the capital and in rural areas. They still continue in rural areas, especially in Burundi's northwest, along the border with the Democratic Republic of Congo, but they're now much less common in the city of Bujumbura itself. However, even with that said, the environment minister of Burundi was assassinated in Bujumbura in January of this year, so the violence does continue. However, still going on in the capital city and across the country are what are very violent searches of what are considered to be opposition neighborhoods, neighborhoods suspected of disloyalty. Mass arrests take place in these. Often all the young men who are found in these areas are rounded up and taken somewhere else. And disappearances, torture, and the extrajudicial killings of opposition activists still take place regularly inside Burundi. The ruling CNDD-FDD party's youth militia, the Imbonerakure, is increasingly being used by the government effectively as a militia force. It takes part in police searches, it's often armed and uniformed and involved in security operations. And these kind of operations are meaning that violence and fear is continuing in the country. There are now over 400,000 registered Burundian refugees in neighboring countries out of a country whose 2015 population was around 11 million. President Nkurunziza and his ruling CNDD-FDD party are probably planning to change the Burundian constitution in two significant ways. Firstly, to remove term limits, which would allow the president to run for another term in 2020. But secondly, to remove ethnic quota and power-sharing provisions within the constitution. Now, many members, both of the opposition and of the CNDD-FDD, believe that removing these provisions is a very dangerous move in Burundi. The reason that they were installed in the constitution was that they helped to bring about an end to Burundi's 1993 to 2005 civil war. This was a war during which mostly Tutsis fought predominantly on the government side, and you had a primarily ethnic Hutu, a rebel force that was fighting against the government. And President Nkurunziza fought with that predominantly Hutu rebel group against the government itself. Removing both term limits and the power-sharing provisions and the ethnic quotas that guarantee a share of the government and of the armed forces to percentages of Hutu and Tutsi to ensure that state institutions can't be dominated by one or another. Removing these is very controversial within the country and has a lot of opposition. And this includes opposition within the military itself. We can see that there are still serving factions of the military that are opposed to President Nkurunziza. For example, 2 colonels and a captain are believed to have been implicated in an assassination attempt against the president's spokesperson in November of 2016. So the president and the ruling party attempting to remove these provisions that are seen as having been critical to ending what was an ethnic civil war is very, very controversial in the country and draws an opposition. As a consequence, attempts to remove these provisions are likely to draw further attempts to oust Nkurunziza by both serving soldiers and by anti-government militants. The 2015 protests against President Nkurunziza's third-term bid were multi-ethnic, and part of the coup attempt against the president involved Hutu soldiers as well. In fact, had a Hutu general in the leadership, General Niyombare. However, since then, the purges that Nkurunziza has embarked upon in the security services and in the intelligence agency has increasingly driven Tutsi soldiers and Tutsi state officials out of these institutions. Tutsi soldiers are disproportionately likely to have fought on the government side during the previous civil war, and thereby for Nkurunziza to suspect them of disloyalty for them having previously been on the other side to him. We've also seen violent police searches of neighborhoods that tend to target what are considered to be the opposition areas of Bujumbura, which is often translated into the predominantly Tutsi areas of the city. What the combination of these purges and these search operations have meant is that the 2 primary anti-Nkurunziza or anti-government militant organizations, Red Tabara and Forebu, have become disproportionately Tutsi through an influx of Tutsi military defectors and local neighborhood youth, Tutsi neighborhood youth who have taken up the arms in an attempt to defend their neighborhood from these searches. However, both of these opposition organizations remain multi-ethnic. Again, Forebu is actually led by General Niambare, who is a Hutu general who actually fought alongside Nkurunziza during the civil war against the primarily Tutsi government of the day. Meanwhile, because the intelligence agency and the military have been increasingly purged of Tutsi members, they've become increasingly Hutu institutions. And the ruling party's youth wing, the Imbonerakure, which is increasingly acting as a paramilitary organization, is also primarily Hutu. And this is undermining the ethnic balance that was supposed to be enshrined in the Burundian state, and in institutions, and in the military by the constitution. Unlike during the previous civil war in Burundi between 1993 and 2005, ethnicity is no longer the primary mobilizing force in Burundian politics. There was actually significant Hutu opposition to President Nkurunziza's 2010 election campaign and to his 2015 third-term bid. So this is very much a cross-ethnic opposition to the president that continues to exist. However, elements within the president and his ruling party have attempted to portray the opposition to Nkurunziza as being a Tutsi cause that they claim is backed by neighboring Rwanda, which they also allege is Tutsi-dominated. So there have been attempts to frame it in ethnic terms in order to rally Hutu majority support for the Hutu president and to spin the conflict in this way. It has also emerged that in late 2016, the government conducted a secretive census of the ethnicity of all state employees. This is over 100,000 people within the country, determining who was Hutu and who was Tutsi. The government has since tried to defend this and claimed it was a routine survey which is necessary to check and see whether or not the ethnic quotas that are enshrined in the Constitution are being met, that the appropriate number of each ethnicity are being employed by state services. However, both the secretive nature of this census and the fact that the ruling CNDD-FDD probably aims to abolish these very ethnic quotas themselves indicates this probably isn't the real reason it was held. Rather, it's more likely that this was a way to gain lists of ethnicities which could be used for further purges within the state services, or to gather data or evidence which could be used to argue that the quotas themselves are outdated and need to be removed. However, because removing the power-sharing arrangements, ethnic quotas that are enshrined in the Constitution is so controversial within the country, any attempt to do so risks the restarting of fighting between elements in favor and opposed to the president within the country. And that brings with it a very real risk of ethnically targeted violence that would accompany this resumption of conflict.